Hey Emma, how are you? Hope it's a nice day there in New York. Jules, I think the problem is that I did not remember today to set up the link ahead of time, largely because I was setting things up today from the grocery store parking lot. Danny, how are you? Cooler, wild rabbit, salad. Facebook is here. Hey, from Waldoboro and Pittsburgh, Florida, Michigan, San Diego, Alabama, Spain. Um, Rhode Island, New Jersey, when you people feel like you're the only people who think the way you do, isn't it kind of fun to see where everybody here comes from? All right, I'm going to jump into things today because there's a ton of stuff going on. And I'm going to start with the obvious stories, but then I'm going to tie them into the larger questions. So let's start with the no, you know what? I'm not going to start there. I'm going to start with the thing that really is jumping off the charts today, and that is that the story of the Epstein files is not going away. In fact, it's getting worse. And you can see real stress on the part of President Donald Trump and the people around him because of that issue. And what's at stake here is that there's a number of layers to this, but that MAGA really believed that Trump was going to release the Epstein files, in part because MAGA has a lot of overlap with QAnon, and they believe that there is a cabal that they thought was dominated by Democratic lawmakers and Hollywood film stars and business people who were implicated in the Epstein files. And the truth of the matter is that if there is one person most closely associated with Epstein, it's Donald Trump, who has a long history with him. And you've heard the quotes about how, he's a great guy and, we both like women, money on the younger side and all those sorts of things. So the Epstein story really was from the early 2000 aughts, and there's a lot of overlap between the Epstein story and the Trump administration. So, for example, in the early years of that case, when a stepmother of a girl said that she had been sexually assaulted at Epstein's mansion in Florida, he got kind of a sweetheart deal on that. And then the person who gave that to him was Alex Acosta, who went on to become Donald Trump's Secretary of Labor in his first administration. That story then snowballed again in 2019 when the Miami Herald said that it uncovered a lot more about Epstein and what happened in his various homes, not just in Florida, but also in New York. And he had a home, I think it was in New Mexico, a home in London. And then, of course, he had an island in the U.S. Virgin Islands that he owned privately. It's about 72 acres, and in which it was an island, so you couldn't get off it. And he did not permit inspectors to come on it. So there's this story in 2019. He got indicted and arrested in 2019, and then he died in his jail cell in that period. This is, of course, is when Donald Trump was in office the first time. And the story kind of died out at the time, but it came back into people's consciousness on June 5th, as I recall, off the top of my head. I could be wrong about that, when Elon Musk, the person who at the time was like Donald Trump's sidekick, he actually posted on social media that the big news was that Trump was in the Epstein files. And since then, the story has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger, which is indicative, by the way, of changing circumstances around Donald Trump. Because remember, much of what we now know was available in the past. So for somebody like me, the real question is, why are people paying attention now? And the answer to that, for me anyway, and you could disagree, is that a number of people have been disillusioned with Trump for a number of different reasons. Things like the bombing of Iran, things like tariffs, things like accepting the plane from Qatar, things like the sweeps of undocumented immigrants who have been living in the United States without any whiff of committing crimes for decades, and they're now being swept up. And people don't like that. Those are overwhelmingly unpopular. The Epstein story is sort of like the final straw for a lot of those people. All right, so if that's the background, what has happened today is you saw things build over the weekend, and then yesterday, which was Monday, the administration released two sets of files that were not the Epstein files. One were the Martin Luther King, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. files, and the other was more information about Hillary Clinton's use of an email server. And let's just be clear about what those are. The Martin Luther King Jr. files, his family and his associates objected to them being released. And you need to remember when you're hearing about those files that that was the collection of information about the Reverend came from a division of the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, that is abbreviated as COINTELPRO. And it stood for Counterintelligence Program. And it was not simply the collection of information about people, it was the illegal collection of information about people with the intent of destabilizing them and hurting them in the eyes of the public. So these files have been sealed since 1977. They were due to be released in 2027, and this is an early release of them, really to try and distract people. And many of us expect that there will be unflattering portraits of Dr. King in that information, because it was designed to be unflattering. And it's worth remembering that these were illegally collected. So the release of those files is seemingly an attempt to get people to think about something other than the Epstein files, although there have been a number of very good studies of Dr. King. So it's hard to imagine that we're going to see anything that's that big of a surprise. Certainly, if there were any illegal activity in it, Dr. King would not have been able to walk around even as freely as he did, which, remember, he ended up in prison a number of times for his work trying to combat segregation. But if they had something on him, it would have come out. So that is, sort of an attempt to say, here, look over here. We have this going on, the same way that you had over the weekend Trump talking, for example, about demanding that the Washington Commanders change their name back to the old racist name it had. The same with the Cleveland baseball team, to turn that from being the Guardians back to what it used to be. He keeps throwing stuff at the wall to see if people are going to notice. And turn the other way, away from the Epstein files. I'm going to do a little bit of a rabbit hole here, just because I think it's an interesting story that people should know. And that's that the reason the United States has so many sports teams, or had so many sports teams named after Indigenous Americans in one way or another, comes from the turn of the last century, when we get the real rise of professional sports. And the idea of those sports teams in that era was to try and take the American men that observers thought were becoming less masculine because of industrialization and because of the rise of white collar work, and to try and make them real men again. And that's why Americans really began to double down on the idea of organized sports in that period. But part of the idea was to create a form of masculine savagery in a limited space, like a baseball field or a football field. Football was really big then, or rowing. Rowing was also another big sport then, or boxing. The idea was to create a sort of manliness and an attempt to erase the weakness of modern society in that period. And so they turned to the names of Indigenous Americans, because in the minds of Euro-Americans in that period, Indigenous Americans were what they would have called savages or uncivilized. And the way of, and naming teams that was supposed to sort of bring out the animal instincts of the men playing in them. So the reason we have all those names, or had all those names the way they were, was really a reflection of American society in the 1890s and the 1900s and the 19-teens. And this attempt to sort of say, yeah, you might be a clerk during the day, but boy, you can get on that field, or you can cheer on the men on that field, and you can be a real man again. So that idea that we need to go back to those names is, first of all, I'm sure Donald Trump does not know that. And second of all, he's just trying to gin up his base and have them say, "Oh yeah, I really care deeply about this." But to my mind, it's important to understand the history of how we got those names, because frankly, it's kind of stupid how we got those names. I'm sorry, that's my opinion. And that's why we have so many of them. Anyway, so he did that over the weekend. He just kept sort of throwing things at the wall over the weekend. And yesterday he did the same thing with the release of the MLK Jr. files, and with the idea that he's going to release more information about former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's use of an email server. And on that, Chuck Grassley, who is a senator from Ohio, has jumped on board. And I'm going to tell you about a couple of these things. I've read that report. I followed that very closely. And that's a really interesting report because it's very difficult to get your hands on. It's a public report, but the only way I was ever able to get my hands on it was to go through Chuck Grassley's Senate website. And what that report concluded, remember, there was a huge attempt on the part of Republicans to find anything on Hillary Clinton, was that she had been careless in her use of an email server, but she had done nothing illegal. There was nothing that came out about that, that they could use. And they kind of hid it when it came out. It came out in October, I believe, of 2017. I think. No. What are we at? We're at 2019. October of 2019. It was October of 2019 where it came out. And just a reminder, you can find that and you can read that. And usually when you have a governmental report or a government report, what they will have is they'll be thousands of pages long, but they have very brief, and by very brief, I mean a page and a half, maybe 2 pages, maybe 2.5 pages, but very brief, very readable synopses at the beginning of them. And that one does, as I recall. So you can read these. You don't have to take my word for it. So they also said that they were going to bring back Hillary Clinton. The other thing that Trump did over the weekend was to release a video, an AI altered video or an AI created video that showed former President Barack Obama forced to his knees in the Oval Office and then handcuffed, and then he showed him in what purported to be a mugshot of him, or looked like a mugshot of him, along with other people who were involved in the investigation into the relationship of Donald Trump's 2016 presidential campaign to Russian operatives. I'll tell you more about that in a second. But what he's doing there is his greatest hits. He's doubling down on racism. He's doubling down on the sexism inherent in the attacks on Hillary Clinton. He is really hitting hard on the idea that somehow the Black hero, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., had something shady in his past. You know, he's really trying to double down on his base, because the base isn't buying it. And that's really important. Now, the other thing that happened today is that both he and his director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, are insisting that the Obama administration, and sometimes he throws in Biden as well, along with former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, were committed treason. Now, this is a really loaded term, and the history of treason in the United States is actually far more complicated than most people realize. I probably will spare you that. Maybe not. But clearly, first of all, they don't understand the history of charges of treason in the United States. But the other piece of that is that they're really trying to reach the idea that whatever Trump has done, those people have committed something worse. Now, think about that. Do you honestly think that former President Barack Obama and former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton could have done something so heinous as committed treason, and the Republicans would not have reacted? I mean, they tried desperately to get any kind of information on both of them and were absolutely unable to do so. So what they are arguing is that, and by the way, they are deliberately misinterpreting what the reports say. And just FYI, I know the Russia scandal really thoroughly. I probably know it as thoroughly as virtually anybody else who is outside the intelligence services. I followed it very closely. I've read all the reports. I've read all the testimony. I've watched all the testimony, the whole thing. So what both the Mueller report and then to a more extreme degree, the Senate Intelligence Committee report concluded about the 2016 Donald Trump presidential campaign and its relationship to Russian operatives was this. The Mueller report concluded that Russian operatives, that is spies, had worked to elect Donald Trump, and that they could not say that the Trump campaign had worked with them, in part because the Trump people refused to cooperate with Mueller. Remember, Mueller is a former director of the FBI and a Republican. He is still identified as a Republican. And that's what they concluded. And the Senate Intelligence Committee report went further. It actually said that the director of Trump's campaign, Paul Manafort, provided information from the campaign to Manafort's Ukrainian business partner, Konstantin Kilimnik, whom the Senate Intelligence Committee identified as a Russian operative. That's in the Senate Intelligence Committee report. But that's all they said. They did not say that the Russians had changed the outcome of the election. We do know that the Russians had tried to compromise state electoral machinery, but the conclusions of these two reports were that they had not altered the mechanics of the election. Now, there's been a lot since then coming out about the psychological operations and their effect on American voters, but that is not those numbers are not in those reports. So when Trump and Gabbard try and say, well, they lied and they tried to undermine this first Trump administration by saying it was not legitimate, that simply was not there. Okay, so remember that when this heats up, because they're going to try to be talking about this going forward. There is also you're going to see that with them really trying to hammer on that, because Trump did that again today in the Oval Office. And then there is also something you all asked about, and that is the attacks of Trump on the Wall Street Journal and on CBS's declining to continue Stephen Colbert's contract past its expiration date in several months. The first of those attacks, the attack on the Wall Street Journal, is the lawsuit is laughable. I mean, I read it when it came out, and once again, it thoroughly misrepresents what the Wall Street Journal actually provided in its article about the letter that is allegedly in the birthday book that Ghislaine Maxwell put together for Jeffrey Epstein. So it misrepresents that, but it also just reads like sort of one of Trump's outraged screeds. And I think what you need to take from that is that he is panicked. There is something that he does not want people to know. And I think we can all speculate about what that might be. And that it doesn't seem to be working to turn people's attention away from it. So one of the things that you might have seen over the weekend was a number of mainstream media outlets saying, well, this has worked. People aren't paying attention to the Epstein cases any longer. But a wonderful article today, I think it was in Slate, pointed out that the source for all the people saying this doesn't have traction was Steve Bannon. So the idea that this is not having traction, you can see, is panicking them enough that Steve Bannon is out there saying, oh, it's not working. He wouldn't be bothered to do that if it wasn't working. So there's that. The other thing you asked about was Stephen Colbert and the cancellation of Stephen Colbert. And that, I think, is especially interesting in this moment. Because it is outrageous, of course. It is worth remembering that CBS is trying to do a multi-billion-dollar deal. And this will $16 million that they paid to Trump for settling his outrageous complaint is peanuts in a $1 billion deal, right? So I think that they probably just threw money at that to make it go away. But the issue of or to make Trump feel good. But the issue of Stephen Colbert is really interesting, because they didn't cancel him tomorrow. They canceled him in months. And what that says to me is that We are very much in a time of flux. Stephen Colbert is a very valuable asset to CBS. They're not shutting him up. They're not taking him off the air. And you could do that. I mean, look at how quickly people can be taken off the air. They chose to give him a lot of lead time. And by the time he's at the end of that, we will have a much better idea about whether or not Trump is going to be able to pull off the authoritarianism that he is trying to, or whether we will, as Americans, push back against him and regain control. So one of the things to watch with a lot of the jockeying that's going on is a lot of people are buying time. You know, they're not throwing in their all with Trump. They're simply trying to feed him stuff and see which way the wind is blowing, which is one of the reasons it's so important for Americans to keep speaking up about the things that they care about. So the big story, I think, is that Trump is panicking, and he's panicking to the point that House Speaker Mike Johnson, a Republican of Louisiana, has called the Congress into its summer recess early, so it no longer has to deal with the with the Epstein case. The DOJ is now saying it's going to talk to Ghislaine Maxwell to try and quiet things. My guess is that's only going to make them louder. This is a real crisis for the Trump administration, and it's a crisis that is hitting, I think, not just because of the Epstein files and the overlap with QAnon, but also because of the fact that so many people are finding themselves unhappy with the Trump administration at this point in his presidency, 6 months into his presidency. And if you think about it, think about what this means. If this were a president who was like Bill Clinton, who was actually enormously popular when the Republicans tried to hit him with impeachment over the different layers of the Monica Lewinsky scandal. And, he really bounced back from that. His popularity was higher after the impeachment than it was before it. That is not happening with Trump. You're seeing the opposite, where people are getting more and more angry because of the fact he is not doing what he said he was going to do. And the question is whether August is going to keep that quiet. Now, at the same time, August is also beginning to show that we're seeing higher prices, significantly higher prices from the tariffs. And the people are more and more unhappy about the deportation that you're seeing. So it's not clear to me that simply sending the Congress home is going to quiet this. In fact, to some degree, it may mean that things get worse. And then we have September and then October, which traditionally in America are periods when people revisit the economy. September always tends to be a period when people start looking at the economy really pretty carefully. And in this time around, you've got the cuts to the Department of Education, which are going to hit schools really hard at the same time that you are watching people go back to school, children go back to school, and you've seen these cuts to the Department of Education. People asked me about the history of the Department of Education, and somebody answered on Facebook that it was started by the Carter administration, and it's one of the things that the Reagan said he was going to get rid of as soon as when he was running for office in 1980. The Department of Education does a couple of things. It does not, and it has never handled curriculum. That's always at the state and the local level. It provides funds to schools that are in poorer communities. It provides funds for programs for special needs children, and it defends the civil rights of students on both race and grounds of race and sex and disability. And so by getting rid of the Department of Education, the administration hopes to be getting rid of those civil rights protections, and it has claimed that the money is it is now not going to spend is going to come from a different group. We'll see if that happens. I have my doubts, but I wanted to throw that in here because the Department of Education actually starts, as you say, under Carter, But it is really important, I think, to understand for American democracy that we almost had a Department of Education in 1866. The Republican Congress in 1866 created a Department of Education when it expanded the Civil Rights Act of that year, which it passed, and it passed this really fascinating creation of a Department of Education with the idea that money from the federal government and organization from the federal government would be distributed by state according to illiteracy. So it was not simply the American South, but it was also the border states, which had a history of not having good public schools. And Andrew Johnson, who was a Democrat and desperate to rebuild his popularity or his party after the Civil War, vetoed that bill because he recognized that if Americans got education, which they were desperate to have, that the Democratic Party would never be able to rebuild itself, rather the same way that the Republicans tried to stand against the Affordable Care Act, believing that if Americans got health care from the Democrats, they'd never vote for Republican again. The same was true in 1866. If people got education from the Republicans in Congress, they would never vote for a Democrat in that period. So it was, he vetoed it, said that the United States government does not get involved in education, which was completely wrong, because in fact in 1862 it had put in place the Land Grant College Act, which did something very similar in a lot of ways. But with that, the Congress has to strip back its education provisions in the Civil Rights Act of 66, which ends up getting changed really dramatically, and tries to create simply an agency, and nothing really comes of it until the 1890s. And then, of course, you see the actual incorporation of education as a department under Carter. But that attempt immediately after the Civil War to spread education is a statement about democracy and the idea that you want to have people be educated enough that they will be able to understand their economic interests, which was really the driving factor behind that 1866 proposal, but also be able to elect people who they think will do the best for what they need. And that idea of an educated populace to support democracy is absolutely central to our country, and one of the things I think we've fallen away on. A little bit of a rabbit hole there, but it always bothers me when people think it was Carter really who talked about an education department for the first time, when in fact it was 1866, one of the great lost moments in American history. Okay, so if this is the case, another question you asked about is what's happened to the Department of Government Efficiency? What happened to the people who were participating in that? Where have they gone? They are still there. And they are performing cuts to the government. And this is an important, weird sort of concept. Remember that it is solely the Congress that can pass legislation. So Congress passes legislation and appropriates money. And the president, the executive branch, is supposed to make sure that those laws are faithfully executed. That's in the Constitution. Not to mess around with the laws, but make sure they're faithfully executed. And what the Department of Government Efficiency people are doing is they are cutting things that Congress has done. Now, the courts have said in the past you can't do this, that you have to actually faithfully execute the laws. But we do have a system called rescissions, which is a terrible word to say. Sometimes the executive branch will look at something that Congress has appropriated, and circumstances have changed so that you can't really do what Congress wants any longer. And what the executive branch will do is it'll say to Congress, hey, things have changed here. If I don't spend this money, is it okay? Will you say that's okay? And what the Trump administration has done is to take those cuts that the Department of Government Efficiency has made and put them into first one, but we expect more, rescissions package. And a rescissions package just passed Congress, cutting $9.4 billion out of the federal government. And Congress said, okay. And that's when we lost the funding for the National Public Radio and the public broadcasting system, NPR and PBS. And this is a dramatic reworking of the way our system is supposed to work. But the Republicans have a majority in the House and the Senate, and so they've been able to do that. And the Office of Management and Budget under Director Russell Vought has said he will continue to do that, as well as to do some other pieces, some other maneuvers to cut more out of the federal budget. Russell Vought is one of the chief writers of the Project 2025, and the goal here is to cut the federal government's social welfare programs and to replace them with the programs you're seeing. What you have seen in the last couple of weeks is a massive change in the way American tax dollars are getting used. They have gone from at least partly funding programs for ordinary people. And now American tax dollars are going into massive tax cuts for the wealthy and corporations. And they're going into a massive increase in our border policies and immigrations and customs enforcement and border patrol. We're really beefing those up to the tune of $174.7 billion. And what we've really done with our tax dollars is created this secret police force in place of things like the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which was food for families that didn't have enough money to eat comfortably. So you're seeing this major change. People asked in the comments today, what are we not seeing from Project 2025 that we should be thinking about? And this is Christian nationalism. What the Project 2025 calls for is it calls for these dramatic cuts to the US government to both to save money and to get rid of the idea of a secular government that creates welfare programs. They want to replace our secular government with a theocracy, with a theocratic government that relies on churches, for example, for welfare, and that instates in the United States religious doctrines. So one of the things that I expect to see is much more emphasis on the destruction of healthcare rights for women, for example, cutting back, they're already talking about cutting back on gay marriage, the secular pieces of our world that the radical right, evangelical white community opposes is something to be watching for. All right, one last question here is elections. You keep asking about whether or not we're going to have elections in 2026. Absolutely, we're going to have elections in 2026. The question is, will they actually be fair? Remember that autocracies in the modern world often hold elections. Russia holds elections. You just know ahead of time who's going to win. And what you are seeing here reflects this uncertainty within MAGA and within the Republican Party about what's going to happen next. Remember, Trump is old and he is ill, both physically and mentally. And he is the one who's been able to turn out his people. Nobody else has been able to turn out MAGA so far anyway. So what comes next? While you are all worrying about that, believe me, so are the Republicans worrying about that. And many of them are desperate to find some way to keep the ability to rile up MAGA or to make sure that other people can't vote. So you're seeing in Texas an attempt to have a mid-decade gerrymander or redistricting. You're seeing that in other Republican states. Now is the time, and you're also seeing a lot of voter suppression in these places. And mind you, we've had voter suppression coming from the right wing since 1998. So there's a lot of people who could vote in the 1990s who can no longer vote. And I'd love to get those people back for the whole definition of democracy. But this is something to be speaking out about and fighting for at the local level and at the state level. That's where gerrymandering happens, is at the local and the state level. So speak up to your state representatives about how you don't want any part of them redistricting at this point, the way they're trying to in Texas. All right, so where does this leave us? Somebody asked, what is the best thing that Democrats can do right now? I'd like to remind you that this is no longer about Democrats and Republicans. This is quite literally those of us who care about democracy against those who are trying to replace it with an autocracy. And the one thing I would really highlight here is that the people who say it's a done deal are not paying close enough attention. That is, if this were a done deal that the autocrats were going to win, Stephen Colbert would not have had a show the night after CBS canceled his contract. Right now, he's still running with it. But what that says is that many things are in flux, and people who have power are trying to see what are their best chances of staying in power. And the way to make them convinced that they should not back Trump, who is sick and ill and probably up to his neck in something he shouldn't have been, um, is to convince them that they want to be siding with those of us who are protecting democracy. So what Democrats should do right now is the same thing that independents and traditional Republicans should do: speak up about democracy, both at the local level and at the state level, but also at the national level. Make your voices heard. Turn out to protest, always peacefully in the United States. I've talked a lot about why that matters here, to be peaceful. But speak out, and speak out not just in words, but in videos. And by the way, I asked you all to tag me in videos. Apparently, it worked so well that I can almost never see when I am mentioned in videos any longer. The system crashes. So I'm going to keep trying to circulate those whenever I can actually see them. I do forward them on, but I can't. I won't forward profanity. I'm sorry, that I won't do. But and sexual jokes and stuff. But that's a great idea. Make sure you forward it for each other. I would love to do that. I did not foresee that I was going to hurt the system, and maybe that's not what did it, but I haven't been able to do it like I had planned to. But use social media, use art. One of the things that, if you think about how people know what's happening in the world, it's through pictures, and that's always been the case. Pictures are much more powerful than words are a lot of times. And those of you who are good at graphic art, those of you, just the No Kings thing, the crown with a slash through it, is really powerful. Music, community building, all of those things that create a community around a new set of ideas about democracy and about what we want going forward are really valuable in this moment, including things like, the causes that are important to you, making sure people get due process, making childcare cheaper if that's what matters to you. Figure out what you care about and don't shut up about it. Because once again, the majority of Americans actually want the sorts of things that people who are called progressives now want. And I always say people who are called progressives because in the 1950s and 1960s, the kinds of platforms that you are hearing from even people like Zoran Mamdani from New York would have been center-right platforms. So what you're seeing is Americans generally are pretty practical, but our political system has slid so far to the right that the platforms that Eisenhower, Dwight D. Eisenhower was a Republican, would have embraced are now considered progressive democratic socialism. And once again, democratic socialism is not socialism. I actually don't like that word because so many people get confused about what it means. So speak up, make sure people hear you, especially now when Congress is going to be on leave for the month of August and now for half of July. Go to town halls. And if your people won't hold town halls, get a Democrat who will, get somebody else who will. Those are great listening opportunities, and they're great community building opportunities. Because I said to you early on that this was going to be a bad summer. It was going to be a very unsettled summer. And I think on that promise I delivered. The fall is going to see a lot of planes starting to land, and how they land is going to depend a lot on what we do in the next couple of months. Anyway, I hope I got to enough of your questions. I'm going to go back to see what on earth has happened in the last few minutes. I guess the final thing I would say is don't let Donald Trump and the MAGA Republicans put a cage around you and the way you think. I'm a little concerned about how many people jump every time Trump does something, because at this point he is a frantic old man, and this is a big country and we have a lot of things we need to do. Yes, we have to deal with him, but we can't let him limit the way we think, because there's too much else that matters. And remember that when you're feeling overwhelmed by him, there's plenty of other things you can do that will move the ball forward. And at some point, we just kind of have to start moving him off stage. All right. I hope that helps a little bit. I'm going to get back to work to see what has happened, and I will see you again Thursday. Oh, I got a lot of stuff coming up on Thursday. I'm going to be talking to Mallory McMorrow of Wisconsin, I think. I asked her if she would come talk to us about planning what we can do. And I'm just talking to somebody else as well this week, and I'll let you know all that stuff. I finished a whole bunch of stuff in my life last weekend, and including a big wedding. And now I really am trying to put everything into some kind of order. All right. Thank you for being here, and I will see you Thursday.